Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well in these extraordinary times. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that continues in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. So we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the new year. Today's event actually is the first event of the winter season. We resume our event calendar after a short holiday break. I encourage you all to check out our events calendar on our website with a wonderful roster of events coming up in the months to come. These include Pulitzer Prize winner Viet Tani Nguyen, Dantiel Maniz, Josh Moore, many, many others. Also, I want to remind you that City Lights Bookstore has remained open to the public. We're following strict San Francisco Health Department guidelines. We aim to make your visit as safe as possible. You will be able to once again browse our stacks. Our business hours are 7 days a week from 12 noon to 8 p.m. We have actually worked very, very hard to transform the store for the age of COVID. The entrance is now on the Broadway side of the building. It's actually at 271 Columbus. The original entrance is an exit only. So we encourage everyone, please do wear facial covering while visiting. We're making our efforts to keep things as safe as possible for everybody. So as many of you know, City Lights is a publishing house as well as a bookstore. We continue to publish in the grand tradition of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's seminal Pocket Poet series. We continue to produce on a seasonal basis new books of poetry, fiction, literature and translation, and nonfiction informed by a progressive political outlook. We have new titles forthcoming from Tim Weiss, Caribbean Fregosa, Tim Miller, Seshu Foster, and many, many others. So to learn more about the books we publish as well as our upcoming events, please do visit our website at www.citylights.com. You can also keep up on our activities via all social media channels. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, you name it. So we are delighted to begin the season and to have with us tonight award-winning author Gina Apostol. We are celebrating the launch of the first ever U.S. publication of her Philippine National Book Award winning novel titled The Revolution According to Raymundo Mata. It is published by our friends at Soho Press. Ms. Apostol is the author of the novel Gun Dealer's Daughter, which won the 2013 Penn Open Book Award and was shortlisted for the William Saroyan International Prize. Her first two novels, Bibliolepsy and The Revolution According to Raymundo Mata, both won the Philippine National Book Award. So Ms. Apostol was a writer in residence at the Phillips Exeter Academy and a fellow at the Civitella Ranieri in Umbria, Italy, among other fellowships. Her essays and stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Foreign Policy, the Gettysburg Review, as well as many, many other places. She makes her home in New York City and Western Massachusetts and grew up in Tacloban, Philippines. She teaches at the Fieldston School in New York City. She's going to be joined tonight in conversation with our friend Mark Doten. Mark is the author of The Infernal. He is one of Granta's Best of Young American Novelists of 2017 and is the literary fiction editor at Soho Press. Also teaches at Columbia University's graduate writing program. He makes his home in Brooklyn, but tonight he is coming to us from Mexico. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that we will be posting links for you to purchase books in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. There's also a Q&A at the end of the discussion. You may post your comments in that same chat function. So such a great pleasure to have both of you with us tonight. Gina, Mark, welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you so much, City Lights and Mark. Mark, did you want me to read or how are we working this?
I think, Gina, we'll start out with, if you could grace us with a few pages of the book, then you and I will have a brief discussion and we'll open it up. I see so many familiar faces, and I know a lot of people who are readers of your work are here. So I think we'll open it up sooner rather than later because I'd love to hear what people have to say. And if you have questions, please, you can start putting them in the chat at any time. I
just want to say thank you so much for coming. I've I've never done a Zoom event where I can see all the faces. So it is making me cry a little bit to see so many people from different places all in one space. So thank you so much for being here. I will read, I'm going to read, I'll start with the preface, the editor's preface. I had not read General Mata's journals when I spoke last year to a Murkian psychoanalyst about the possibility of hysterical abreactions occurring on a national scale. This was during a lull at a conference at a floating restaurant on Manila Bay. Or was it a fish market in Kowloon? I can't keep those junkets straight. There was a full moon, and we could see the marble columns of a colonial building nearby, a monstrous wreck that gave the shantytown around it a nasty glamour. The scholar was an unshaved blonde, the kind one often meets at academic conferences. She was expounding on independence movements as, quote, macroscopic examples of aggressivity in the analysand, unquote, while she fondled some frangipani and picked through the pectorals of a Peking duck. It struck me as she manhandled vertebra and munched on the fronds or vice versa, that academic blondes are aggressive boars. To compare our revolution, the crux of our history, to some hysterical patient on a hypothetical couch was just icing on her slanderous cake. But what did I have to offer her as evidence of the irreducible reality of our history? I knew no scholar, no text, not even a comic book that spoke of the Philippine War of Independence without disturbing solipsism or deeply divided angst. It's a history that invites neurotics to speak up. It's no great surprise that it ends up a vulgar patient in obscure neo-Freudian journals. So that's Estrella Espejo, who is the so-called editor of the memoirs of Raymundo Mata. And I will read this addendum. Dr. Diwata Drake's inspiring defense. First of all, I am not blonde. Yes, I read the Finnish Peruvian philosopher retired to the jeweled coast of Provence, Claro Murk. Guilty. I would wish that crime on my enemies. However, more pertinently, I'm an American of mixed heritage, a Midwestern mongrel, but I'm Filipino on my mother's side. Okay, half Filipino on my maternal grandmother's side, but the Viking ancestors in my father's Milwaukee line might add Eskimo, so there. Blondness is only a pharmaceutical indulgence in my family. In other words, and I never confessed this to anyone but my first love, who then promptly abandoned me, I'm a bottle blonde, Clairol spun gold number 34. That I have a nervous disposition, I will allow. As Murk says, and I paraphrase, to each yama his own symptom. My papers on the psychoanalysis of the Filipino independence movement are no accident, as my own analyst has betrayed to me. The seed was my experience in the Wisconsin public schools. I wanted so much to be part of their group, the dairy-damaged cretins who pulled at my brunette braids and once hung me from the gym rafters in a rug while singing the theme song from Fiddler on the Roof. I'm not Jewish, I kept saying, but I was in a rug and they couldn't hear me. My interest in the Philippines was inevitable. The country has a history of self-loathing that may not be necessarily unfounded. I'll end there.
Oh my God. Thank you, Gina. I'd like to begin by talking about language. And some of this may be basic for, I see we've got some strong Filipino representation in the audience, but I'm curious in how you view language and how you view this particular text with regard to what I've heard you talk about as, the multiple colonizations that the Philippines has undergone from the Spanish, from the Americans, and then moving into this, period of globalization. Can you talk about the very unusual and interesting ways that your multiple narrators use language and how the history of the Philippines informs that.
Yeah, the narrators speak English. They're looking at a text that is variably Tagalog, Spanish, some Chabacano, some fake Ilocanos. Actually, the Chabacano is very fake. So there's a panoply of languages here, which I think is really an aspect for me of the way I grew up, where I was so very conscious of languages because I spoke Waray at home. I had to learn, I had to speak and write and learn in English. I had to also learn Tagalog because that is the other official language, and Tagalog is like an enemy language of the Warays. And I also, I learned Ave Maria Gratia Plena, stuff like that, the Hail Mary in Latin. And then I also when I was growing up, Spanish was required in college. So that's a lot of languages. But so for me, there's an interesting aspect of, and it comes from colonization, it comes from a number of things. And I will say this, that we have our languages. We have around 150 languages in the Philippines. And we've kept our languages. I think keeping the languages has been a form of resistance in the country. So language is a form of resistance. Even the way we use Spanish or English, even the way we mess up Spanish. The way we mess up Spanish is really incredible. It's a work of art, the way Filipinos mess up Spanish. So I've always seen the Filipinos as this, a definition of them is a translated self. At the same time that I recognize that about Filipinos, I recognize that about humans. So in one way, for me, the Filipino is like hyperhuman. It's like an uber humanity in that even as babies, I mean, that we are socialized into language. So we are socialized into our alienness. Once we start speaking, that's a separation from our primal desire, which is to be only the one in the world. So that uber humanity that lies in the translated lingual self of the Filipino, for me, only makes me recognize the existential kind of symbolism of the Filipino, which makes me write.
Yeah. I see in the chat, Rico mentioned some strong Filipino representation in the audience, and I'm not sure if that's echoing what I said or if it's correcting what I said, but in any case, there is strong Filipino representation in the audience. Gina, thinking about language in that way, and I think this is certainly true of this book, of Insurrecto, and of all of your books, the sense of humor and play does emerge in some ways from that sense of multiple languages, of things, people who can both speak around things and say so many things about something, and also who can't quite capture it through their language. There seems to be this tension that drives the humor. And I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yeah, that's really cool. And no one's ever mentioned that. No one's ever mentioned the tension. People always ask about, about the fact that Filipinos love puns. We're just we're a very punny people, and you can imagine why. Because we, in order to be ourselves, we have to have multiple languages, and so punning is the best way to get at it. Punning is a form of resistance as well. But people have never talked about what you mentioned, which is that there's a tension between that kind of resistant attachment to the language and recognizing its multiplicity, and the fact that it's actually very hard. It's very hard to get at exactly the core of our way of experiencing the world, because necessarily the multiplicity, it's part of our colonial tragedy, but that necessarily we're always recognizing that if I say it this way, it might mean this thing in this other way, and then this other language actually, so there are all of these ways we're multiple beings, and it's hard to express the kind of weird antenna that you might have. Of course, W.E.B. Du Bois spoke to it, when he talked about the double consciousness. And so that double consciousness that Du Bois talks about is very much, I think, it means a lot to the Filipino. The only thing is, for the Filipino, there's a reversal to that, because there's the fact that we've kept our languages, and there's like this secret that we have that we know is ours, that we're not going to be sharing, so even for the Phil-Am, I think, even if you don't quite know the language, it's still a secret that you have that you're not sharing. Do you understand that? It's still a core.
Mm-hmm.
So
Gina, you're taking on a major figure in the history of the Philippines, Rizal. And, there are different accounts of this history, but,
my account is the best.
And canonical version is that he is the founding father of the Philippines greatest novelist, a revolutionary, and, basically the person on whom the modern Philippines was built. First of all, how do you feel about that mythos? How do you feel about the two novels we have? And then, so this is, you have 10 minutes to answer this question. It's a very big question. And how did it relate to writing your book?
Well, okay, that's a lot. But one is, I would say this about the Philippines, that we're a very lucky country to have Rizal as our founding document. It's a very lucky country. I think another country that's like that, not a founding document, but Brazil with Machado de Assis. Mm-hmm. And they're around the same era. Mid to late 19th century. We're very lucky to have as founding documents novels, because the contingency of our ways of seeing ourselves becomes very apparent. We're also kind of unlucky in that Rizal becomes unlucky because we end up misreading him sometimes. We misread him as a hero. Rizal was very much an artist. And the novel that I decided to write had to do with, I grew up, I'm going to show you some things, because so because we're at home, I can actually show you these things. So this is Rizal. This is Rizal in grades. When I was growing up, I read one book about Rizal every goddamn year. So I have here the book of, here's Rizal, grade 3, his student days. Here is Rizal, grade 4, his travels. So every year I had to goddamn read about goddamn Rizal. I hated him. Because he was like this guy who, the way they told his stories was like, he lost his slipper on the boat ride. Therefore, he threw away the other slipper so that one poor boy could get the 2 slippers. What the hell? So he's this very annoying, canonical is really an understatement for Rizal. My husband, when we used to travel around the Philippines, my husband was American, he would say, there's another statue of Rizal. I said, I never noticed it. every goddamn town in the Philippines has a statue of Rizal, as they should. So there's something annoying about the canonical aspect of Rizal, but then later on, I actually really did read him. And El Filibusterismo is my favorite novel. It's an amazing novel. Especially if you think about the era that he was writing in. You're talking about, so the stuff he read would have been, you know, Les Miserables. So Hugo, his favorite was this guy, Eugene Sue, who wrote The Wandering Jew and The Mysteries of Paris, stuff like that. But, you know, at the time also, Flaubert was beginning to write, you know, Flaubert was out there. But this guy did a kind of interesting free and direct discourse narrate. This is filibusterismo. Filibusterismo is for me, the novel that for me is the very art novel. So filibusterismo, with the free and direct discourse that's kind of going into Flaubertian mode. And I don't think he read Flaubert. But using Tagalog, using Chabacano, using his version, using Spanish, obviously it was written in Spanish, using even English. He used English because the guy spoke around 8 languages. And yeah, a key line in filibusterismo is in English. And so when I read him, I was going, oh my God, this guy is so amazing. And we don't read him as an artist. We read him as a hero who's stuck in this, you know, pedestal in all the different towns. The only town that didn't have Rizal was an Ilocano town that had lunas. So I wrote with the desire to see the guy as an artist, and in some way kind of a reversal or a shift in a way the Filipinos might view the history, and therefore that mirroring of the Filipino self through this reversing of Rizal in Raymundo Mata's. So you can see already that the different reversals that I'm talking about. The boomerang reversals in the novel. Through these mirrorings, I was hoping that one could see the revolution in this light that was, in my view, very powerful. That the pride that the Filipinos should have in this history should be enormous.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that speaks to so much. You mentioned El Filibusterismo as a particular favorite, and that was one. So I hadn't read Rizal until I started publishing you, and then I was like, okay, let's find out about this Rizal. And both books are amazing, but particularly Filibusterismo seems experimental, strange, wild. It's very much of a piece with its sort of confidence games, with Melville's The Confidence Man.
Yeah.
It seems very saturated with the same ethos, even though I doubt they read each other. I think my question for you is about experimentalism in literature, for lack of a better word, which in the late 20th century, or maybe that 20th century into our current time, has been seen in America as the province of white men. And we can name many people, including in your New York Times review today, you get compared to Nabokov, you get compared to David Foster Wallace. But it seems also like this a liberatory mode for the colonized, for the oppressed, for people who are working out of a different tradition. Mercado de Assis is a great example of this, with this utterly wild novel. It's as good as, you know, Lawrence Stern or Cervantes. Like, it's just, or Melville, bonkers and great. Can you talk about why, what are the ethics or politics of writing in these more discomforting experimental modes that you use in your novels?
The ethics and the politics of it, I will just go with the history of it, you know. And it's great that you talk about Stern, and I love Stern. Talk about, and of course, Machado de Assis. The history of it, I would go back to Rizal. I'm going to show you another thing. Okay. Here is Rizal's, this is called the Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. So Sucesos, so a history of the Filipinos. So it is a history of the Philippines by this guy Morga. Okay, so he's a former oidor. So he was he was a government official. But if you go and look at this part, those are all footnotes. A lot of the Morga is Rizal's footnotes. So he has a whole novel in footnotes, I would say. My thing is that the Morga is Rizal's third novel, not the Macamisa. And he just goes on and on and on. I mean, look at this. Look at the footnotes there. That's like half the page. So I would say also that this is very much like the annotated text is very much, and Ninay by Pedro Paterno. Whatever you say about Pedro Paterno, no matter how crazy he is, he wrote Ninay, and that's also in footnotes. So I think, again, the translated self is also an annotated self. And so that, if you read Joaquin, who doesn't have footnotes, but he footnotes in his work, because in order to read Joaquin well, you have to know the Philippine-American War. You have to know the war of Filipinos against Spain. You have to know World War II. It's so the contextualizing in the people who are, of course, it's not a great thing, colonized, is there in their art. And so I would say that the work that I did, for instance, with Raymundo Mata, given that I absolutely love, my advisor in grad school, John Barth, is
one
that,
of the crusty old white men.
yeah, these are endemic as well to the colonized. That the colonized is endemically experimental, because we have been experimented upon, and we are, the experiment in modernity that everyone, we are the experiment in modernity.
Can someone please write that down and transcribe it? Because I want to make sure that line gets in the press release for Gina's books, because that was such a smart and such an interesting way of thinking about that. All right, I'm going to go. I assume this will come up in the chat questions, but I do have questions about politics, our world now, and maybe we can even bring Peter back from City Lights to talk a little bit about the history of literature and politics at the store. But let me begin with a question from Laurel Flores Fantosa. What were any changes from your reaching a Philippine audience and writing that first draft or the first edition and the first release?
Is that about the revision?
I believe the question is what were the changes for writing to a Philippine audience and now writing to a possibly largely white American audience. And
Okay, so I will say that I wasn't really writing to an, I'm sorry, American audience, but you guys haven't been writing to me for quite some time, I will say. I did not write to an American audience, even in this revision. But what I did write was, I was writing during the Trump regime. So I did have a problem. I did have a question for me, and it came from a Filipino reader of Raymundo Mata. And she asked, given the instability of texts that arises from this history, and given the recognition that that instability has effects, why repeat it in your novel? Why you know, just it made me think about fake news, and the problem that I had with the novel was to make it very clear that the construction of illusion that is the kind of at the base of my novel, the construction of text within text within text, and then recognizing through that there's this instability that girds our truth. I wanted it to be very clear that it girds truth. And
Yeah.
so because what the problem with fake news is that that it's based on power play, that this concept of fake news created by Trump, it's constructions of text for power. But mine is constructions of text for truth. And for me, truth is that we construct illusion. That's how we create nation. Nation is illusion. And what we're trying to do is create the better illusion. That's our job. That's the ethical job. Choose the better illusion. And so I wanted it to, my revision was suffused with the anxiety that, the anxiety of that my Filipino readers that came to me from that Filipino reader's question, which I thought was a very good question.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. The other thing is, this is a novel that can be endlessly redone. The construction of this novel is of infinite addition, which for me is an aspect of the Filipino a concept of history and a concept of nationhood. Infinite addition. A revolution that's not done.
I'd like to say that the jacket copy for the book, in my original writing, addressed precisely that, how the process of revision that the book had undergone reflected and echoed the concerns and preoccupations of the novel itself and the characters in the novel.
Yeah.
But the powers that be decided it was getting to be a little too abstruse, and we cut that line out. So just to be clear, in my question to you, the asking if you were writing to a white American audience, that was not in Laurel's question. That was my add-on to it. Okay, and a sort of accentuating question from Michael Morse about revisions, going back to the text and reworking it. I think you did speak about that very generally in the last question. Can you name a specific thing you changed and why you made that decision in the book between the first and then this one?
One thing that one thing, it's a kind of broad idea that I had that's in the footnotes. And I was very clear that the footnotes couldn't have a full story for each of the characters. The characters, it would be too much to have the story of Raymundo Mata and then they also have a full narrative. So what I did was I gave them a skeleton narrative. So that's what I did in revision, that I thought that there had to be an arc for them. And that was also part of my thinking about this construction of illusion and attaching my reader to the reality of the book, that the book is a reality and it's an important reality. So so the very, very slim narrative arc that allowed each to have a recognition by the end, you know, that moved my text into what I thought would strengthen that attachment to the book as reality. So that's what I did. So that's kind of a bigger part, and it was interesting because as a writer, and you can do whatever you want until, and then your editor tells you don't do that, but you can do whatever you want. It was actually a huge. I had to restrain myself from creating a story for the three. I took those things out. I needed only a subtle arc that led to anagnorisis, as they say, you know, recognition, the Aristotelian. There had to be the Aristotelian recognition at the end.
Well, I think each of those characters comes through in a fully embodied way from their first sentence in the book. They're all nuts.
They're all nuts.
They all have really strong opinions about literature. That's what makes the book so wonderful. Okay, I've got a question from Heidi Lee here, and I think I'm going to ask you that, Gina, and then I'd like to loop Peter in, and maybe we can think about the politics of our moment, bookstores, city lights, etc. And by the way, you've probably seen there are links to buy the book that have been appearing in the chat. Please do so. It has been a challenging year for publishers and for independent booksellers. And, you know, every book sale counts and means something. Question from Heidi Lee. Are there current movements in the Philippines that give you hope for the liberation struggle against the Duterte regime?
Okay. I grew up, so I went to school in Diliman. And so I grew up seated with National Democratic politics. So I grew up Nat Dem. And so there really is a very strong, I mean, the Philippines really does have a very strong activist movement. A lot of the people in jail right now are women. For instance, the Duterte regime really goes after women. There have been women who have been jailed while they're and they refuse to leave their babies at home, so their babies are in jail. And so there's one woman who was the child of a political prisoner who grew up in prison with her father and now is nursing her baby in prison. The Duterte regime is killing people, but you have to understand, there are people to be killed who are fighting him. And that is an amazing aspect of the Filipinos, that there are people there who keep doing the fighting. A lot of them are women. There are people right now in Tacloban's jails. They're from my province, Waray, and they're environmental activists. You know, my province was the province that was killed during that super typhoon. You know, tens of thousands of people dead, and so they decided they were going to do something about the environment. They're being jailed. So there are many movements on the ground in the Philippines. There are coalitions of forces. Of course, they're being killed. And I will say this, our American tax dollars are killing those people because Trump gives money separately from the military budget straight to the Philippine police. That's killing people. So we need to understand as Americans that we can also act. There is a PHRA bill that we're trying to get through right now. I'm part of this group called Malaya. And there's a PHRA bill, a Philippine Human Rights Act, that a California, I think a California representative is presenting in Congress. And we should be telling our Congress people to go and support the PHRA. Mm-hmm. So there are many people on the ground. There's, you know, Duterte he has to go 2022.
Well, given Duterte's pretty strong support in the country, if you look at polling, I'm curious about, and this is jumping ahead to Bibliolepsy, your next book, which Soho Press will publish 1 year from now, and which is set during the, the revolutionary actions that overturned the Marcos regime, the Marcos dictatorship. What can happen now that will make things change, flip, grow, build, whatever it's going to be to get Duterte out?
Well, his regime is supposed to end 2022. That's the end of his 6-year term. He has not said that he's gonna, I mean, there is what they call the cha-cha. Filipinos are into the abbreviations. Cha-cha means a dance, but it also means charter change in the Philippines. So charter change, or cha-cha, is changing the constitution again. We've already had 3 constitutions. So no, actually, yeah, 35, 87, 70, 72, and 87. Okay, yeah, 3 constitutions. So yeah, he's trying to do the cha-cha, which is funny, trying to do the dance. But there is a huge push against the cha-cha. So I think that, yes, I'm just noticing here the Rice Not Bullets campaign led by people in Mindanao, just these different groups. The very resistant people in the Philippines are Mindanao people, the Muslims in Mindanao, and the Lumad, the indigenous people in the country. So just to note that. But his daughter wants to run, but once Duterte is like Trump in that there's a weird person cult to him. So I don't know if it'll transfer to the daughter. And I'm not on Facebook, so I can't completely follow Philippine politics if I'm not on Facebook. But it has to happen through constitutional means. That's what's the change has to happen that way, because the revolution's not gonna happen right now. It has to go through politics.
If I missed the question,
if you're a dual citizen, vote. Make sure you get your dual citizenship and vote.
Yes. There's a lot of comments in the chat. If there are questions that I've missed, please repaste them. Peter, I want to talk to you and maybe kind of open this up to you and Gina. So Peter, you've been in a bookstore that's been a center of activism and revolutionary possibility since it was founded. You were talking a little bit about Lawrence Ferlinghetti as we spoke before everyone joined us, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see things now at City Lights, how your founder is, and how goes the revolution.
Well, it's easy to identify with Gina's work because City Lights has always been at this place where the intersection between literature, art, and politics all meet. City Lights, you have to understand, when we first opened up, was at the edge of Manila Town, actually where North Beach and Manila Town met. The I Hotel, which is still there.
It's still there, yeah.
And is just right around the corner.
Oh.
So there are so many historical threads. And but I think to really kind of understand like how this, kind of ties in a deeper way, we have to understand like Ferlinghetti had some very formative experiences during World War II. A lot of people don't realize he was a naval commander on both subchasers and troop carriers for World War II. He was in the Normandy invasion, and it was actually in France where I think his literary life kind of opened up. And it was in the Pacific Theater later where his political life opened up. And he was one of the first officers to walk on Nagasaki after the bomb had been dropped. And this had just like a tremendous impact on him. Later, like he was compelled to just search out as much as he possibly could on sociology, on politics, on history, reading people like Smedley Butler. He wrote a wonderful book called War is a Racket. and that he was one of the most decorated Marines in World War I, had been approached by industrialists to overthrow Roosevelt. So this is kind of where Ferlinghetti's coming from, and he thought a lot about language. He thought a lot about, and in fact, and though we're known as being kind of like the home of the Beat Generation, true, but you know, literature and translation, language has always been at the heart of the publishing end and the bookstore itself. And this is all very, very important because it's through empathy, it's through identifying with, you know, others that, you know, communication happens. And I think this is, you know, what, you know, Ferlinghetti, he's still alive, by the way. I mean, he's almost 102. He still has a brain. He can still function. He's frail as ever. Spends a lot of time in bed, but you know, to have him all these years as a guiding force, he really is incredible. So,
well, in the Zoom era and the pandemic era, I doubt he spends more time in bed than I do. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Now I'm curious about Gina's opinion about iHotel, but maybe I should hold that until after this. Gina, what about how do you feel about the current political moment? This is a question I'm only asking you because everyone's going to ask it to you every single time you do an event for this book. How do you feel the revolutionary politics and the revolutionary potential that you write about in Raymundo Mata relate or don't relate, are completely disjunct from our historical moment and the events we've been seeing even over the last few days?
Well, one thing I said was that it's very clear that the people who called the Filipino revolutionaries insurrectos and called these terrorists, these coup weirdos, patriots, the sign of whiteness in that terminology, which, you know, was very clear to me, you know, because Filipinos were called the insurrectos. They were called, but they were actually fighting for their freedom, which in fact, and I do say this in this book, they echoed the language of American revolutionaries. You know, they loved Jefferson, they loved Thomas Paine. I mean, Jose Rizal did this in his papers when he died. They found this document called Ang mga karapatan ng tao. So that's the rights of man. So it's all in Tagalog. It was word for word a translation of the goddamn rights of man. So, you know, so the ideals of the revolution they believed in, of the American Revolution. I do have a long discussion here in the novel about the misrecognitions and mishearings of themselves in that revolution. They didn't see themselves as the Indians being killed by George Washington in the Indian Wars, in the French and Indian Wars. They saw themselves as George Washington. But and that, you know, so that kind of stuff in the novel. But they were called insurrectos.
Yeah.
The people who actually believed in their ideals.
And how does it feel to move from a country with a criminal and kleptocratic government to another country with a criminal and kleptocratic government?
Obviously, I feel very comfortable in my discomfort. Everything. I mean, the whole Trump thing. I was just like, oh wow, yeah, it's so familiar, and I know that Rico is here. Rico, I remember unfriending Rico on that whole thing about. I really believe, you know, that no matter how, you know, you have to see the evil of Trump. He's a fascist from the very beginning. You could see that he's a fascist, and and so nothing has been very surprising. Everything has been hugely grievous.
Yeah. Well, on that grievous note, I would encourage anyone who has a question they want to ask Gina. And I have heard her sound off on some very narrow and specific things about politics of the Philippines. So if you want to know something about just how big of a criminal conspiracy some certain politician is running right now, Gina will have an opinion on it, and she will give it to you. Although maybe she shouldn't do it over Zoom, where it will be lodged for all time, and you do still travel back to the country.
I think Tracy has a question.
Great, Tracy.
I'm wondering how you think of mischief as a literary technique of sorts, and the use of mischief in meaning making politically, philosophically, and so on. Yeah, I think that's so spot on. You know, the level of structurally and on the smaller level of jokes, intra-sentence puns, and so on. Yeah, that is so much part of the kind of the work of decentering and the work of reconceiving the self in some way, or to gain that truer, to gain a sense of, you know, through the recognition of these fractures, of these fragments, using using language and really kind of, I'm not destroying language. It's just, but recognizing the ways that language can be deconstructed is part of, I think, a very political aspect of writing, and that's certainly something that's going on a lot. And unfortunately, it goes on a lot in my novels. My next novel isn't going to be as much like that, but.
What? Less bilingual punning?
The bilingual, no, that's still going.
Bilingual punning, Gina?
No, trilingual. And I do think that mischief as a policy for art is useful, it's productive, it's ethical. Especially when we're in a world where the sense of, well, when we are being cheated of our sense of right, I think.
I'm going to close with a bit of a downer of a question from DJ Jazz, and then, although maybe not a downer, maybe you'll have something really inspiring and uplifting to say. And I encourage everyone, if you haven't had a chance to buy the book yet, please do.
Oh, to support fascism,
the publisher, I have
Stockholm Syndrome, comfortable familiarity with dictatorship. I think we should look at class in those issues in that case. I think that when people look at immigrants to the United States, they always think of them as poor people, American dirt, blah, 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 blah. But you have to understand, a lot of the people who can immigrate are actually of a particular class. And when you're allied already with a particular class subjectivity, a class condition, you are going to go, given your kind of negative space in this country, you're going to look for the fascist type, you know, the bourgeois who moves from the Philippines to the United States. They're the ones who are supporting Duterte anyway. And so and not necessarily so, but even when they come to the States, the attraction of Trump makes sense. I think the worker might be a lot less, but the middle class Filipino American, those are dangerous. Those could be very dangerous people, because they are already allied in the Philippines, probably with the Marcos people. Yeah. Not all, okay. But I think, well, what I was trying to say there is, we don't think about class when we think about immigrants.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great issue in question, something that you deal with a bit in Insurrecto.
It's like I was saying about American Dirt. You know, when I was hearing about the plot of American Dirt, and I'm thinking, okay, this lady owns a goddamn bookstore. She's gonna fly to the United States. She's not gonna go in the mules or whatever. It's so obvious for a Filipino bourgeois. You know, a Filipino who's going to be killed by someone in Duterte land, and they own a bookstore. They're gonna fly. They're gonna fake their passports, because they have the means to do that. That's why I thought it's so obvious that American Dirt is a stupid novel just from the plot alone. You know, the other thing that it made me recognize about Mexico, Mexico must have such very, 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 very good writers that this is the one that they choose. It's, you know, like, so I started reading Mexican novelists, and the last Mexican novelist I read was this guy who wrote about a tennis match between Caravaggio and Quevedo. Oh God. You know, and in it was this weird hat of an Aztec that was the center of a beautiful epiphany in the novel. You know, it's like, and that was being compared to Caravaggio's art, the weird feathers in an Aztec hat. I mean, that, a tennis match. It was, the whole novel was a tennis match.
I guess we should put that novel into the chat as well, so people can buy that one.
I forget what it's called, unfortunately, because, you know, I have this short term.
All right, so it's, I forget what it's called, unfortunately, by a Mexican.
Ken will tell you. Ken, you put it in.
Thank you, Gina. God, it's so great to talk to you. I wish we were together in person and could just keep talking.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much, City Lights.
Yes.
You know, this is a temple. It's a temple for any writer from the Philippines.
You know, the only thing I regret is that we can't all go out for drinks, because that's the traditional thing.
I know.
After these events is we hit the local watering hole. So rain check, I think, is in order here.
You know how little action my work MasterCard has gotten in the last 10 months? Practically zilch.
That's got to change.
So I think we're going to keep this open for just another minute. Peter, is that right? So people have a last chance to find the link, buy the book, and remember to look for the other book. Just Google Correggio and tennis, and you'll get there. All right, so just to fill airtime, Gina, any funny anecdotes? Anything weird happen in quarantine? What have you been eating? Do you cook?
Oh my God! Well, I will tell you this. Ken is online, but Ken is an amazing chef, so it's really bad. I mean, I occasionally post Ken's dishes to my little to the Signal group, but I can't do it too much because it's so upsetting for other people. They're so good. Ken makes
or that you get on Insta, because you're on Facebook and Twitter, or you're on Twitter but not Insta, right?
I am on Insta, but yeah, I only write. I only do the memes on Insta.
What's your handle?
I don't know. I think it's my name.
Huh. Well, there's like 10 other Gina Apostols who come up ahead of you.
I think I'm your friend on Insta.
What?
I think I'm your friend.
Okay, well, I was trying to tag you in something earlier and it was not letting me tag you. Peter, are we good on time? Do you think we can close it down?
Yeah. So this has been fantastic. Gina, Mark, you make a great interviewer. Thank you both so much. I hope we can do this again, you know, sometime. Our doors are open. And what a great audience too. Thank you all for, you know, great comments, great questions. This is just a fantastic way to start the year. Good omen. And this is going to be rebroadcast actually on YouTube. So if you know anybody that actually missed it, in a few days, we'll send out emails to everybody who's like registered, and, you know, we'll let you know. But thank you. Thank you all. This has been fantastic.
Total joy to be here. Thank you for hosting this.
Thank you to everyone. So good to see everyone. Thank you.